Okay, thanks y'all for joining us for another editorial board conversation. I'm Josh Brodesky, I'm the editorial page editor, and today we're really lucky to be joined by Julián Castro, a man who needs no introduction to our audience, but I'm going to introduce you anyway. Julián, sure. Former mayor of San Antonio, former secretary of Housing and Urban of HUD, and also presidential candidate in 2020 who was outspoken about police reform. So Julián, thank you for joining us. And just really quickly before we dive into questions, I'm going to just let you all know who's on the call. We're joined today also by Mark Medici, who's publisher of the Express-News, Elaine Ayala, a Metro columnist. On the news side, Scott Huddleston, a news reporter, Brian Chasnoff, a news reporter, and then also from the editorial board, Carrie Clack and Gloria Padilla. So thanks for joining us, and we're really grateful for you, Julián, for having this conversation. I think I'm just going to kick off the questions here, but I think my first question is, you recently endorsed Vice President Joe Biden, and he reached out to you for guidance about police reform issues at the national level. And I'm just curious to hear, what you would recommend, what policy prescriptions you would recommend to the Vice President to address these ongoing issues that we've seen.
Yeah, and first of all, thank you very much, Josh, for the invitation to join the editorial board. Sorry that we're not able to do it under usual circumstances. I've enjoyed over the years the opportunity to get up to, are you all still using the 7th floor, the conference room and stuff? But it's still great to be with everybody and to see some familiar faces, and want to say hello to Mark. We had the opportunity to speak briefly the other day, and best wishes as y'all undertake, I think, a time period for the Express-News of great opportunity and also, of course, very obvious challenges too. I guess the best place to start is to say that over the last week or so, over the last few days, all of us have seen, and I think felt, a sense of urgency about reforming policing in this country. The death of George Floyd, which came after the death of so many others, especially young Black men and women, at the hands of police officers who utilized excessive force, has, I think, woken up a lot of people in this country to the fact that we can't let things go on the same way. And all of the videos that we're watching subsequently from these protests of officers who have gotten out of control, who have lashed out, I think is a very powerful demonstration that the problem is not a few bad apples. I mean, don't get me wrong, we know that there are a lot of good police officers. I worked with a lot of them here in San Antonio, but the problem is the system is broken. So as a presidential candidate, I made this one of the points of focus of our campaign. And we released a plan to reform policing in America. It's still up on the website that we had for folks that are interested in seeing it. But essentially it said, look, and this would be my advice to Vice President Biden and to Congress and to mayors and to state representatives and governors across the United States, that we need to end over-aggressive policing. That means doing things like setting a use of force standard that says lethal force should not be used unless all other reasonable alternatives under the circumstance have been exhausted. It means ending that federal government program that has militarized the police, giving them the machinery of war that has been on display over these last few days in cities throughout the United States. It means banning racial profiling and banning stop and frisk that in different American communities, but I think especially in New York, were weaponized over the years to harass people of color, especially young Black men. We also drew up how we can increase accountability in policing. And there's a lot of groups that are doing great work on this. Maybe the best that I'm sure folks have heard of is Campaign Zero, that has this campaign called 8 Can't Wait, with 8 different use of force policies that can be put in place with accountability that have been shown based on research to reduce police violence and police shootings specifically. So we want greater accountability. That also means ending qualified immunity. Qualified immunity has protected police officers who have engaged in excessive force from being able to be sued in civil court by victims of that excessive force and their families for way too long. It started off as a modest doctrine, but in the last 15 years especially, has gone off the rails, totally out of control, so much so that justices on the Supreme Court with different doctrinal approaches, from Sonia Sotomayor to Clarence Thomas, have both expressed reservations about qualified immunity. The court is going to have an opportunity to take up several cases related to qualified immunity soon, and I hope it does, and I hope that it's at least restricted. In addition to that, greater transparency. There are a number of ways that we can become more transparent in police departments, including the San Antonio Police Department in the years to come, and we can get into some of that as well. And also, we talked about making investments in nonprofits at the local level that are working to mend the rift that too often exists between law enforcement and some communities and neighborhoods in cities. There are groups that are doing good work out there, and I think that we should invest in those efforts. So those are some of the different ways that I think we can fundamentally change policing in this country. Let me just address, before we get into some more specific questions, a couple of things that have been brought up lately, which is a movement, for instance, to defund policing. Look, I know that we're not, for anybody that is out there that is saying that we're going to abolish police or you're going to completely defund police. I served as mayor of a city of, at that time, more than 1.3 million people. There is a role for folks that are going to enforce our laws. And I think all of us would agree, in an ideal world, would we not need police because everybody would follow the law and you would have no need for any kind of, sure. But we know that we don't live in that ideal world by any means. And that the best route right now is to focus on deep, meaningful reforms that we can make to actually improve this situation and ensure that no matter the color of your skin or what neighborhood you're coming from or anything, that you're treated the same and you're treated fairly and your constitutional rights are respected by the police, and that the police are able to do their jobs and be as safe as possible, and you know, do a job that everybody can be proud of. However, having said that, y'all may have seen that Los Angeles, for instance, announced 2 days ago that it was looking at a budget cut to their police department of $100 to $150 million. I absolutely do believe that right now, as city budgets have been rocketed or rocked across the United States because of a lack of sales tax and hotel occupancy tax and other taxes that they rely on, where they're having to look at deep cuts in different departments, that the police department should absolutely be subject to the same scrutiny that the Public Works Department or the Parks and Recreation Department or the libraries or any number of other departments are. We cannot get into this dynamic that the US military budget is often in, where it only goes in one direction, you know, up and up and up, even as crime has fallen tremendously in most American cities. If you compare where we are now to where we were 10 years ago, where we were 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So while I don't believe in defunding the police entirely, I do believe that there are opportunities to make meaningful cuts in some places and rethink how we use an officer with a gun. You know, if you look at FBI statistics, something like 5% of crime, of all crime, is violent crime. 5%. So just as the San Antonio Police Department has gone to administratively taking complaints or handling issues, certain types of issues, if somebody has a minor crime to report, you don't need to send out a police officer. I think that cities across the country should evaluate when do you actually need to use a traditional officer and when do you not? Because that can go a long way, I think, in reducing the cost of law enforcement in our cities in a sensible way. I know that's a long answer, but as y'all know, I mean, because everybody on this Zoom has followed these issues in their journalistic career, there's a lot there. There's a lot there at the local level, the state level, and the national level. So, you know, that's just the beginning of my perspective and how I see it.
I can't, okay, I think I'm unmuted. What do we do? How do we translate these policy decisions that we're making, sitting around the table? How do we carry those out in the front lines when we have policies in place that don't allow police chiefs like McManus to discipline officers? Often some of the disciplinary action he takes gets reversed, and these officers end up back on the front lines. And a lot of times they end up back on patrol because there's no way they're going to get promoted. And so they're the face of the police department in our communities.
Yeah, it's a great question. And what it highlights is that the mayor, the city council, the city manager have to come up with a plan that is multifaceted. There are changes that we can make that are purely administrative that McManus can make himself in conjunction with the city manager. In fact, a good example of that is, for those of y'all who have checked out that 8 Can't Wait campaign website, you know that San Antonio is rated there. There are 8 different policies that they recommend. San Antonio is cited as having implemented 4 out of those 8. And I have the list here just for conversation's sake. The ones that we don't have yet are requiring a warning, an officer warning somebody before shooting, requiring that all alternatives are exhausted before shooting, banning shooting at moving vehicles, and a requirement of comprehensive reporting on use of a weapon. So every time an officer actually draws their weapon or points it at somebody, there's a requirement of reporting if he or she discharges it, but not necessarily if they just take it out and point it. So these changes can be made administratively. There are other changes that need to be made in the police union contract. People will remember that in the last round of police union contract negotiation in 2015, there were several changes that Councilman Ray Saldana, in conjunction with the city negotiating team, had pushed for that related to different disciplinary issues that would have improved accountability for officers that use excessive force and engage in other violations of police rules and of the law. The city negotiating team pushed those disciplinary rule changes all the way up to the time when it got to arbitration. And in the final stages of negotiation, a majority of the city council did not see that as a priority enough to pursue. Because at that time, the main focus was on salary and benefits and such, right? I think that was a mistake to drop the pressure on those items. Because if you think about it, you know, the salary and benefits, all of that is important. You know, it's important negotiation for the police officers themselves so that they're well compensated for the budget of the city, and that means the taxpayers. But we can see very clearly with the things you and I are talking about today, we're talking about people's lives and stopping injury and sometimes death. So the union contract is another place where changes need to be made. And then you refer to state law. We need to make changes to Chapter 143 of the Texas Government Code that often overlays and sometimes preempts the ability of cities to make meaningful reforms. A good example of that is the right of a police officer to have an arbitrator after there's discipline or after they've been terminated. They can appeal that. They appeal that eventually to an arbitrator. And that arbitrator oftentimes has ended up reinstating officers who were terminated by Chief McManus. This happens in American cities all the time. It is an example where we need to go to the state and we need to get the state to change that. But I would also challenge kind of the fundamental, if there's a sense that we should just throw our hands up and that we can't make any progress. No, actually, we can make progress because some of those changes can be made administratively by Chief McManus. And so, I shared with the mayor that what I believe is that he should, we should understand as a community what changes can be made administratively, what changes need to be made in the police union contract, what they're going to put on their legislative agenda to lobby the state for, changing 143 when the legislature starts in January. And then are there also other investments or help that the federal government can offer through the Department of Justice or through legislative changes there?
How do we overcome the fear of elected officials because of the clout that the police union carries locally in terms of endorsements, and at the state level with the lobbying power of the of CLEAT? They are very powerful, and a lot of these reforms that you say have been proposed go nowhere because we have these strong lobbies locally and at the state level. How do we fix that?
It's a great question. I think in San Antonio, of course, it's true that across the board that police unions have a lot of power locally. There's no countervailing force in a lot of communities, including in San Antonio, to the police unions. You don't have the Texas Organizing Project or another group that might offer the same kind of organization to propose policy changes and work toward them. Cops Metro, by and large, has not been involved in those kinds of issues in the same way that they've been involved in job training and infrastructure investment and so forth. Number one, I think if we're talking about the long term, there needs to be an investment in a countervailing force of organizing and pushing city council members to look at this in a more balanced way. Secondly, in San Antonio, I do think that there's opportunity with the San Antonio Police Officers Union, with SAPOA, because they're probably at their weakest since they were after the 1988-89 union contract. If you notice, the people on the city council dais right now, I think one or two of them were supported by the police union. They ended up supporting a lot of people that lost, right? So they're toothless tiger in a lot of ways right now. And the fight that they got into with the city manager over the police contract, I think essentially that it cost them a lot of political clout and standing in the community, because along with the firefighters, that was a very contentious back and forth. And although there was a police contract first, I don't think people came away with that believing that the union was just doing that in the best interest of the voters of San Antonio or the taxpayers of San Antonio. I would say to the council members that these events have basically put you on notice, that there are a lot of people in the community that are watching you. It's not just the bubble of people that are around City Hall, including the police union. It's the citizens of San Antonio out there who want to know what you're going to do now to improve this situation. Because I think a lot of the council members, a lot of local politicians, they are uncomfortable going against the police union, but there's a good number of them also that would. They just don't think that anybody prioritizes those issues. People need to show that they prioritize those issues, and they have been showing that in the streets of San Antonio over the last few days.
Thank you.
Various Republican leaders have expressed interest in criminal justice reform and police reform, What's your assessment of the potential bipartisan support for this, given the George Floyd case, and who will those leaders be?
Well, my hope is that there can be bipartisan work. As y'all saw a few days ago, Representative Justin Amash introduced legislation to end qualified immunity in Congress, and he got congressional representatives, as far apart as Ayanna Pressley and I think some other Republicans to sign on. I mentioned on qualified immunity the two justices that are diametrically opposed in terms of their perspective. So I think on qualified immunity, it's a good example of the opportunity that we have to at least restrict it, if not end it, in the courts or legislatively or both. I hope that there are other issues, transparency, for instance. I have thought for a while that the media need more access to these personnel records and easier access. Right? There's a lot that is done to shield discipline that is handed down on an officer, including wiping away the record of that discipline after a certain amount of time, that makes no sense in protecting the public from cops that shouldn't be in the department. And I think that perhaps is one place that we can work. Another may be that as cities scrutinize their budgets, the whole thing that these conservatives have talked about forever is that they don't want to be spending money, that they less taxpayer dollars basically. And so perhaps there's an opportunity there to find common ground on making smart, reasonable adjustments to those budgets in the future.
Carrie, you ready to chime in?
Yes, Julián, in your in the People First policing plan, you addressed the school to prison pipeline. Could you talk specifically about the effect that school disciplinary measures have on the futures of Black boys and Black girls who are stigmatized in elementary school?
Yeah, hey, Carrie, I'm looking for you here on the Zoom panel. See you. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, so one of the things that we tried to do in the campaign was to connect the dots on how these policies really work together and how we have created this pipeline to prison. So we called for reforms, for instance, and I was happy to see the Minneapolis schools do this the other day, ending the use of police officers to enforce discipline at schools. Research has demonstrated very compellingly that these officers overuse their power, especially on young Black men and more broadly on young men of color. There's also research that shows, no matter who you are as a kid, when you have those kinds of interactions with authority, with law enforcement, that dims, your sense of self and your prospects for the future. So, of course, there's going to be discipline in schools, but we don't need cops being the ones enforcing that discipline on a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 17-year-old. We need for people who are educators to be able to do that job. There may be instances, for instance, if there's violence, there may be instances we've seen with school shootings where it makes sense to have a police officer present at a school. I'm not saying that you should never have a police officer present at a school, but I don't believe that they should be the ones enforcing discipline.
Thank you.
I have two questions for you, if the group will indulge me. The first one is, we've seen some, here in San Antonio, as we've seen peaceful protests, we've also seen some fairly heated exchanges with police, including Tuesday night, where there were non-lethal weapons fired. I was wondering if you could speak to, your thoughts on what you've seen in these exchanges and, how this should be addressed going forward. And then my second question is, in your People First Policing plan, you talk about quite a bit, you outlined the importance of body cameras. And, here in the George Floyd death in particular, we have cameras all over that, and it didn't seem to make a difference in terms of stopping what was happening. So I was hoping just curious to hear your thoughts on if we have put too much hope in body cameras addressing these issues. So whichever one you want to take first.
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, there is research that suggests that body cameras are not having the impact on reducing the use of excessive force that people had hoped they would. So absolutely, anybody who thinks that just because you have body cameras, that's going to be, this overall solution, this panacea, that's not true. In fact, people have body cameras. These officers know that folks are recording them, as you said. People have cell phone cameras. Many of these instances, these videos that we've gotten, I'm thinking, for instance, of the Walter Scott video from South Carolina a few years ago, because people are recording them, right? So we know that video is not enough, that you have to go way beyond that. Now, having said that, if you're a policymaker, would you rather have body cam footage or not? Of course, you would rather have the body cam footage, because what it adds is it adds a layer of evidence to be able to figure out what happened. And so while I think it's not as impactful as people had hoped it would be in terms of trying to lower the incidence of the use of force and use of excessive force, I do think that it's still a useful tool, very useful tool in determining what happened, so that especially if there are charges to be brought against an officer, that body cam footage is additional evidence, or maybe the only evidence that we can rely on in some cases. Let me address your question about Tuesday night. From what I've seen, I'm convinced that the SAPD made a mistake in using rubber bullets and wooden bullets against the demonstrators. I had an opportunity to review the footage that was put on Twitter, and I believe there was some on Facebook. I looked at the statements that different journalists made on Twitter about what happened, and I'm convinced that they went overboard. And I want to sketch out just briefly, if people will think about sort of the logic behind what the police is saying and how they're acting versus the situation on the ground. Number one, Saturday night's crowd had been a bigger crowd, right, than Tuesday. And what happened on Tuesday in terms of the activity had happened on Saturday, but there was more restraint that was exercised on Saturday. Chief McManus said that officers would fire those projectiles, the rubber bullets and the wooden bullets, if there were bottles thrown at them. I think that that's a bad threshold for that kind of action. I say that because there's clear research that those projectiles can kill people or injure them severely. There was one study that said something like 3% of people hit by those projectiles, it was fatal to them, and that 15%, it severely injured them. In the last few days alone in Texas, we've seen in Austin, a 16-year-old boy that had to have 7-hour head surgery because he was hit with one of these. We saw another young man, I think, who lost an eye in Austin, and one in Dallas who lost an eye. So how can we say that the use of these projectiles is acceptable when you know going in that they're going to hurt people. They already admitted, the SAPD admitted, that they don't have as much control over where they go as they would a normal bullet. Right? So they don't have control over them. They know that they're going to severely hurt people and can even kill them. But the only threshold is that somebody throws a water bottle at officers who are completely armored up with their shields on. And I want you to think about this for a second. You know, they say that if somebody throws a water bottle, that it could be bleach, it could be something else that could harm the officer. So they assume the most dangerous thing that can happen when it comes to the officer's safety. But when it comes to the public safety, Chief McManus said that these bullets, these rubber bullets, just cause a welt. So they're assuming the best possible outcome for the public. That's so backward, because the public are the ones without the riot gear and the protection. They're completely exposed, and the police are the ones with their riot gear on, totally protected, but they're benefiting from an assumption of the worst harm, and the public is being punished with an assumption of no harm at all. It makes no sense. And my hope is that SAPD is going to discipline officers who should not have utilized that force on Tuesday, who I understand may be part of the SWAT team, because this is the kind of change that I'm talking about. This change is not, you know, changes to policies, to approaches. It doesn't happen, you know, just somewhere, you know, on paper. It has to happen in practice. And so I hope that they're going to use that opportunity to change their approach in the future.
Julián, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
I want to continue on this thread, because I think it's maybe the most interesting part of this. Where do you think culturally this comes from with inside of the policing in America? I was raised in a family of Marines, and I find it very interesting that from a military perspective, you don't fire until you're fired upon, right? Lethal force in our military is the last resort. It is not the first resort. You've been very active the last 10 days on social media, posting videos of what I would call exceptionally overzealous use of force by officers. The video of the elderly man in Buffalo essentially being advanced upon was just stunning. To me, it's a cultural issue inside of policing. And as a champion of reform, where do you think that is rooted? Where does it come from?
I mean, I think it comes from a culture of lack of transparency, of officers over the generations being able to get away with having their version of events believed, accepted. You know, I think, you know, and I'll say writ large, that this is a challenge also for American media. I mean, American media has the benefit of these videos. I think it's time for American media, for newspapers, for television, for every other type of media, to scrutinize even more and to actively challenge the version of events that police departments put out. No more just quoting what their spokesperson says and not trying to find an alternative viewpoint on that. You know, I see TV news all the time, reports, and it says in the last 10 seconds, you know, and whoever the spokesperson is said blah, 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 blah. I mean, it comes from a culture from within the department of, you know, watch out for your fellow officers, don't speak out against your fellow officers, and also from having gotten away with being believed all the time. In that incident that y'all saw last night from the Buffalo Police Department, the Buffalo Police Department original statement said that that gentleman had tripped and fell, that he tripped and fell. And in the George Floyd case, the initial statement from the Minneapolis Police Department said, I think that he was resisting arrest. On Tuesday night, the statement from the SAPD, this is, I acknowledge these are not that's not the same thing, this is a lesser scale, but said that those, as I read at least, that the protesters had thrown glass bottles. Nobody saw any glass bottles. Maybe they're going to find them with the body cam footage that they're reviewing. What I think everybody saw were water bottles. So, you know, you have this culture of exaggerating, sometimes outright lying, shading the truth, omitting information, and it gets believed, accepted by a lot of people. The last thing I'll say about that is I think it goes into a deeper psychology. People will remember, you know, there was at one time the Stanford prison experiment, I think from 1971, that fundamentally was trying to get at situationism and the extent to which people behave in certain ways because of the situation they're in and how they're empowered. In that prison experiment, you know, mock prisoners and mock guards were put into a prison scenario, and the people, regular people, students who had signed up for this experiment, some of them were assigned as guards and some of them were assigned as prisoners. The guards took on this persona of enforcing discipline and being cruel. And so I think there's a culture that develops there, that has developed, and that's where we need to totally reimagine. We need to break that culture and change it, improve it, and totally reimagine how we go about policing communities.
Do we do that with a third party investigative type body? I mean, we have internal affairs and they investigate themselves, but do we need somebody from the outside reviewing some of these cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's I think that that can be very helpful. As you know, in different places, we have these civilian review boards. Although I think the history of civilian review boards is such that in many places they don't have much teeth. But I think, you know, improving civilian review boards, giving them teeth. Also, as some have mentioned, when there is an officer who uses excessive force and there are charges to be brought or may be brought, that those cases be reviewed by a district attorney that is not from the county where those police officers work with that district attorney and, you know, all the lawyers underneath him or her, because oftentimes there are relationships that develop. They're testifying for the cases that are brought forward in criminal trials. They're part of the same law enforcement structure. So does it make sense to use another county's district attorney to decide whether to bring charges and then to bring them, or even the Attorney General's office in the state of Texas? Now, I mean, it's no big surprise to anybody on this call that I don't have much faith in Attorney General Paxton, and we need a lot of improvement there. However, there may be less of a conflict of interest there than even though we actually have right now in Bexar County, I think, a district attorney that has been about as good on these issues as you know, as we could have hoped for, and has made a lot of improvement. You know, Joe Gonzalez has been very active on criminal justice reform issues, I think, in a positive way. But just generally, does it make sense for not the district attorney from your county to deal with these issues? I think generally it does, yeah.
Julián, you've been sounding the alarm on the need for police reform for some time now throughout your campaign, your presidential campaign. I wonder if you feel like the moment right now with George Floyd and these protests, does this feel different to you? Does this feel like we're at a turning point in terms of actually affecting some change? And if you feel that way, then why? Why is it?
I mean, it does feel different because just the circumstances of all of this. I mean, we've just gone through 3 months of being, you know, sequestered, being quarantined because of COVID-19. More people's attention is on this. Somebody was remarking to me the other day, which I thought was a good observation. I mean, look, sports are not going on. People are not going to the movies. Most people are at home, or a lot of people are at home. They're not going into the workplace. It has the nation's attention, number one, in a way that usually something like this is competing with a million different other things for people's attention. And so people are more focused on it. Also, unlike in 1992 with Rodney King, or even I would say 6 years ago with Michael Brown and Ferguson, there's a lot more footage, a lot more video out there. And every single day of these last 10 days, the police have been giving people more and more and more evidence of a rotten inside culture of, acting out, lashing out when they shouldn't. And so, and the demonstrations have been, as President Obama pointed out the other day, people of all different backgrounds. And during these demonstrations, people of all different backgrounds have been the victim of police brutality, as we saw with that elderly man yesterday in Buffalo, right? And so I think that everybody can see that, hey, this certainly is this is a deep, longstanding, this inveterate problem, especially for Black men and women. But that culture also, that police culture, and police lash out, and they often are also using excessive force against people of different backgrounds. Everybody. This impacts everybody. People are getting that more, and so I hope that it is an inflection point, and that we can make real changes. I was very encouraged the other day when Vice President Biden was specific about the changes that he would like to see made, banning chokeholds, a model or national use of force standard, demilitarizing the police, which the Obama administration had begun to do, and that was reversed by Trump, and called for more police accountability and transparency. It was very encouraging because, he's serious about it. He's specific. It's not just, we need to heal our nation and we need justice for George Floyd. Absolutely, we do need that. But what does that actually mean? He talked about that, and that was very important, I think.
Julián, I wanted to ask you about your perspectives locally and nationally on where you think the San Antonio Police Department and Bexar County Sheriff's Office rate in terms of, the national law enforcement landscape, and, whether we're more at risk or less at risk of excessive use of force, and also how you might advise the mayor and the city council to address, the concerns that you spoke about regarding the handling of the protests, and moving forward. I believe the collective bargaining agreement is set for renewal in September of 2021. So how might you advise them?
Well, I guess let me take different parts of that question. I think San Antonio is in some ways better than average, and in some ways worse than average. Better than average. Let's start there. This police force is more diverse than most police forces. In that sense, it's more in line with the composition of the community. And the hope is that you have people that are not reflexively afraid of the citizens that they're policing. Another way, and I think rightfully the police department has garnered a lot of good attention for this, is the mental health unit. I applaud Chief McManus and the entire police department for what they've done on mental health training for officers, understanding how to de-escalate situations. And I hope that they can take those lessons and apply them more broadly from there. But that's fantastic. Our community has become a model for understanding that just because somebody has a mental health condition doesn't mean that they're dangerous. Don't treat them automatically like they're a danger. When we think about below average, my understanding is that San Antonio has one of the highest rates of officers who've been terminated actually getting their job back. And this again goes to I believe both the police union contract, but especially Chapter 143 of the Texas Government Code, which needs to be revised. So we're both above average and below average, depending on the policy that we're talking about. With those 8 different 8 can't wait policies, we have 4 out of 8 right now. There are 2 communities, Tucson and San Francisco, that have done all 8. I would challenge San Antonio to be a community that has done all 8. With respect to what I would say to the mayor and council, I mean, I think Mayor Nurnberg gets this. He didn't support the last police contract. He has voiced concern for improving discipline and accountability and transparency in the police department. You know, and I think in many ways, Chief McManus also, he understands this. He has generally been moving the police department in a better direction. He has been acting to terminate officers that should be terminated. They've improved policies from the mental health unit to several use of force policies. They've pursued changes in the police contract that the city council did not have the political will to push at the end. So, you know, Chief McManus deserves the credit for what he has done to improve policing here in San Antonio. And, you know, I don't want the conversation that we're having to take away from the very real improvements that have been made. But I also want to point out the ones that still do need to be made. I don't, what was the last part of your question, Scott? Because I think you had like 4 parts there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm a little bit concerned about what you said about what occurred Tuesday night, that you felt that the officers went overboard. And what do you think that our city leadership needs to do about that in the short term?
Well, they're doing an investigation. They need to finish the investigation. They need to be transparent about the findings of that investigation. If in fact it reveals that officers used inappropriate force, then my hope is that if they can identify who that was, who started that they're disciplined and that the community understands that there will be accountability. Maybe most importantly, beyond that one incident, that I think they need to look at their policy for use of force in these protest situations, because I don't think that somebody throwing a water bottle or even 2 water bottles should necessitate using rubber bullets, wooden bullets, pepper balls, and tear gas on a crowd, 99.9% of which had nothing to do with the plastic water bottle that was thrown. But you're shooting into that crowd, and we can have incidents like we saw in Austin and Dallas and other places. I mean, I think, you know, at least from what I can tell, we did not have somebody that lost an eye. We didn't have somebody that had to have 7-hour head surgery like they did in Austin. In other words, they were fortunate. People were fortunate because that could have easily happened.
Do you, I'm just curious on the non-lethal weapons or use of force. Do you see any place for that in modern day policing, or should we be having a discussion about completely doing away with those non-lethal options, you know, wooden bullets, rubber bullets, tear gas?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to figure out, are there instances where police officers may have to use some sort of non-lethal force? Sure, there are. But the entire challenge for policymakers is, and for administrators, is where do you set that threshold? And, you know, my argument is that right now that threshold is being set far too low. And it's benefiting from a culture of acceptance in, I think, generally the media and also the public. And Josh, let me just touch on this. You know, I think it was April, we just passed 50 years since Mayor McAllister in 1970, in an interview that he gave to NBC News, made derogatory comments about the Mexican-American community. He said that they liked their flowers and their music, and you know, that was taken very badly by especially activists at the time, including my mom, who went out and protest the San Antonio Savings Association, SASA, that he owned, and got arrested for doing it. But the point that he was making was that you had, he was saying, a group of docile people that basically just wanted to get by. You know, that assessment, I think, was grossly wrong and racist. It also always haunts me because I want to make sure that the public out there never sits back and accepts that, you know, just because that people in authority can get away with, especially injuring or killing people who they're supposed to work for. I think too often, and this goes back to Mark's question, too often the police act like they're supposed to be, like we're supposed to be protecting and serving them, like the people work for them. They don't. They work for the people, and they need to act like that.
Julián, I've got to, we only have a few minutes left. You've been really generous with your time. This has been just unbelievable. Thank you so much. I hear, you know, and this didn't just happen with George Floyd. We hear this anytime a unarmed Black man or woman is killed by a police officer. There is this conversation of what conversations happen inside of a Black family when a young Black man or a young Black woman is stopped on a routine traffic stop by a police officer. And, you know, I can't imagine the anxiety that either one of them feel as a police officer is approaching their car when they are completely innocent, maybe just have rolled through a stop sign. What are some things that you would like to see happen right now that would make that conversation easier for Black families in San Antonio and in across the country?
Well, number one, yeah, I would like to see a greater forum for people to listen to that perspective. Like one of the comments that I've consistently heard coming out of people that have been around the protests here in San Antonio and other places is that it's a lot of young people, right? And that here in San Antonio, that the number of African Americans who are protesting surprised a lot of people. I don't think it should be a surprise, but surprised a lot of people. The African American population in San Antonio, I think, is 6 or 7%, right? But what it says is that there's a great disconnect there. I don't think that we're doing enough to hear those stories and to listen. And we've had in San Antonio this history, even in the last few years. I'm thinking of cases like Marquise Jones that should have sparked those conversations that have not. So I think, number one, a better forum to listen to folks. People can do Facebook Lives with those families that have been impacted by this, to give them their opportunity to share their concern and perspective and call for change. In addition, you know, I think a lot of the good reporting that y'all have had on that has given the opportunity for a voice from these young organizers has been great. And then I also think, though, that, I mean, the biggest difference is going to be the actual policy changes. People need to see the policy changes, because politicians can talk as much as they want about coming together and that we can make this better. But the way that we change things in our country is that you actually change how people behave, and you start that with changing policy. So my hope is that as that continues, that those families are going to be able to breathe a little bit easier. A third thing I'll mention is just changing the nature of, as I said before, how we police communities. Policing has a history in this country of being weaponized for a very long time against Black families, from the days of slavery to Jim Crow and beyond that. And so it is time to reimagine what that relationship should look like.
think we'll wrap there. That's an excellent point to end on. Julián, thank you again for meeting with us and being so gracious with your time. And for all the viewers out there, we will continue these conversations going forward. So best of luck to everyone. And again, thank you, Julián.
Thanks,
All
Julián.
right. Thanks a lot, y'all. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Julián. That was wonderful.